Vice President.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations so that, setting aside private interests, wholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the Vice President.
Honorable Senators, I wish to inform you that the President of the Senate, Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, is currently out of the country. Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Anil Roberts, Senator Evans Welch, who are ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the President Paula May Weeks, ORTT. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by Her Excellency Paula May Weeks, ORTT, President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to Mr. Harvey Boris. Whereas Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo is incapable of performing her duties as the President of the Senate by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago, and the Vice President of the Senate is required to perform the duties of the President of the Senate, and as a result a vacancy has arisen in the Senate, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Harvey Boris, to be a member of the Senate temporarily with the effect from the 16th of November 2021 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of Senator the Honorable Christine Kangaloo, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 15th day of November 2021. To Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, whereas Senator Anil Roberts is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of illness, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(b) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, acting in accordance with the advice of the Leader of the Opposition, do hereby appoint you, Tim Gopi Singh, to be a member of the Senate temporarily with effect from the 16th of November 2021 and continuing during the absence of Senator Anil Roberts by reason of illness, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, the 16th day of November 2021. To Mr. John Heath, whereas Senator Evans Welch is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of illness, now therefore I, Paula May Weeks, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, John Heath, to be a member of the Senate temporarily with effect from the 16th of November 2021 and continuing during the absence of Senator Evans Welch by reason of illness, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President St. Anne's, the 16th day of November 2021. Honorable Senators, Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Harvey R. Boris, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I'll bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I'm about to enter.
I, Dr. Tim Gopi Singh, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by the Bhagavad Gita that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I'm about to enter.
I, John Heath, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Honorable Senators, I now invite tributes on the passing of former Senator Ambassador Christopher Thomas, Minister of Trade and Industry.
Mr. Vice President, it is with a very heavy heart that I rise this afternoon to offer condolences on behalf of the government bench in this Honourable Senate for one of our very own distinguished sons of the soil, Mr. Christopher Roy Thomas, known more commonly as Ambassador Thomas. Ambassador Thomas was a remarkable man who dedicated his life to the service of others, to the service of country, and to the service of the regional and international community. As a lover of languages, he began his career as a teacher and professor of language at the secondary and tertiary levels. His teaching style focused on inspiring his students and finding ways to translate his passion to them. He was fluent in English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. His service to country began when he entered the Foreign Service in 1967. Within a year, he was assigned to the embassy in Caracas, Venezuela, as a second secretary and was quickly promoted to first secretary by 1969. In 1973, Ambassador Thomas was appointed Counsel of the Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York. The early success in his career is a testament of his innate drive, determination, diligence, and excellence. Years later, in 1990, Ambassador Thomas was appointed as the Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, and there he began his service to the international community. Ambassador Thomas was critical to the working of the OAS and played a significant role in ensuring cooperation between countries. Upon demitting office 10 years later, his colleagues revered him as an adamant defender of human rights, multilateralism, and representative democracy. After his stint at the OAS, Ambassador Thomas transitioned to Senator the Honorable Christopher Thomas as an appointed member of the independent bench. His service spanned varying periods in the 6th, 7th, and 8th Republican parliaments from 2001 to 2003. His contribution to the legislature and people of Trinidad and Tobago cannot be understated. His return home was symbolic of his commitment to service and ensuring the betterment of his beloved country. He serviced for many years as chairman of the Public Service Commission, Police Service Commission, and the Statutory Authorities Service Commission. Mr. Vice President, in addition to being a man of service, Ambassador Thomas was a fair and honest man, so much so that he was called upon to lead members of the OAS's mission to observe and monitor parliamentary elections, such as the St. Lucia general election in 2006. This honor is bestowed upon a select few and is testament to the character of Ambassador Thomas. An example of this time, the majority of Ambassador Thomas's life was deeply rooted in service and love for the well-being of others. He served with distinction, honor, and integrity. His sound diplomacy and astute ability to foster cooperation among others was greatly admired and would surely be missed. Those who had the pleasure of working alongside him can attest to these very admirable qualities. Mr. Vice President, there is a famous quote from Albert Einstein which says that only a life lived in the service to others is worth living. I can say with confidence that Ambassador Thomas lived a wholesome 84 years of life. Mr. Vice President, on behalf of the government, I extend heartfelt condolences to Ambassador Thomas's family, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. May God cover them with his comfort and love and see them through these difficult times. As a nation, we thank his family for his service and the sacrifices that have been made, appreciating the demands of what is required when serving in various platforms. May his soul rest in eternal peace. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ambassador Christopher Roy Thomas was an outstanding public servant. Most people may not have known him because he was a very low-key individual. In fact, most people may have probably never even heard his name. Mr. Vice President, at the national level, he became permanent secretary in the then Ministry of External Affairs. He also served as our ambassador to Venezuela. In addition to English, Ambassador Christopher Thomas spoke Spanish, French, and Portuguese. And before joining this country's foreign service, taught languages in Jamaica and at St. Mary's College in Porto, Spain. After retirement from the public service, Ambassador Christopher Roy Thomas served as an independent senator and chairman of the Public and Police Service Commissions. Later, he became chairman of the Statutory Authorities Service Commission. At the hemispheric level, Ambassador Christopher Thomas became Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, the first and still the only Trinidad and Tobago national to serve in that capacity. At the international level, Ambassador Christopher Thomas, not yet an ambassador, was elected chairman of the powerful Fifth Committee of the United Nations in New York. That committee, Mr. Vice President, dealt with administrative and budgetary matters. He was also deeply involved in the law of the sea matters, or in law of the sea matters. Ambassador Christopher Roy Thomas was a quiet man with no bombast about him. He did his work efficiently, and he did it well, and was one of the best public officers that Trinidad and Tobago has produced since our political independence in 1962. Christopher Roy Thomas was a very humble, unique, decent, dignified, and a man of integrity. A staunch defender, as my colleague said, of human rights and representative democracy. On behalf of the United National Congress, on behalf of my colleagues on the opposition bench, we would like to record and register and to deeply express our collective condolences to his family and friends. Mr. Vice President, just a month ago when I learned of his health challenges, I had the opportunity of communicating with him directly and to inquire of him of his state of health. And of course, in his humble way, he indicated that everything was okay and he was doing fine. And I wished him, the best of health and speedy recovery. Today, he's no more with us. We celebrate the life today of an extraordinary citizen of our republic. May his great soul rest in perpetual peace, and may he rise in glory.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to pay tribute to Ambassador Christopher Roy Thomas on behalf of my colleagues on the independent bench. He's been described as a patriot, a statesman, a diplomat par excellence, an educator, a gentleman, a friend, a father to many. He was born on May 10, 1937, and left this realm on November 11, 2021. His education was vast and wide. He was educated at the University of London. He held a Bachelor of Arts in Modern Languages. He also attended the University of the West Indies, where he got a diploma in education. At the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom, where he received a Master of Arts in Political Science. And also New York University, where he was awarded a Master of Arts in International Politics. As my colleagues have indicated, his professional career was vast and wide. He was a lecturer in international relations at UWI St. Augustine campus from 1966 to 1967. He was the head of the language department, Champions College in Jamaica from 1964 to 1965, and the language professor at St. Mary's College in Trinidad from 1956 through 1961. Among the many positions he held in public service included Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador to Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, Assistant Secretary General of the OAS, the Organization of American States, United Nations Inspector, Geneva, Switzerland. In terms of commissions, he was the chairman of the Public Service Commission, also the Police Service Commission. Ambassador Roy Thomas was awarded this country's Shakonia Gold Medal for public service in 1997. He served on this independent bench from the 9th of October 2001, the 12th January 2001 to the 9th of October 2001, also the 5th of April 2002 to the 28th of August 2002, and also on the 17th of October 2002 to the 31st of December 2003. He debated admirably and contributed to several bills, including but not limited to the Planning and Development Bill 2001, the Telecommunications Bill 2001, the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2001, the Finance Variation Appropriation Bill 1999-2000 Bill 2001, the Air Navigation Bill 2001, and the Appropriation Bill 2002. He served on committees including the House Committee of the Senate and the Public Accounts Committee, and represented Trinidad and Tobago at many international conferences, including the Inter-American Economic Council in Santiago, Chile, on June 4, 2003. Upon his passing, there were several tributes paid to him, including Basil Ince in 2018, or before his passing, I should say, who described him as an eminent diplomat and international relations expert. He's been paid tribute by many far and wide since his passing, and this country owes a great debt of gratitude for his service, unwavering service to Trinidad and Tobago. To his family, his 3 children, his colleagues and friends and associates, we send our deepest condolences and thank them for sharing him with us and his sacrifice for Trinidad and Tobago. On behalf of the members of the Independent Bench, we also send our condolences, and may he rest in peace. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Honorable members, I too wish to join with you and the national community in expressing condolences on the passing of former independent Senator and Ambassador Christopher Thomas. From your contributions, it is evident that Ambassador Christopher Thomas had an illustrious career of public service and was admired and respected locally, regionally, and internationally. Ambassador Thomas served as an educator, a diplomat, a former permanent secretary with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, an independent senator, and as a chairman of 2 service commissions. Ascending to these positions speaks volumes about his leadership, his acumen, and the caliber of the man. There's no doubt that his commitment to the development of the public service of Trinidad and Tobago would have contributed to him being bestowed with a national award, the Shakonia Medal of Gold, in 1997. At the end of his stint at the Organization of the American States, in June 2000, it was noted, and I quote, "Ambassador Thomas fulfilled the functions of his office with great dedication and efficiency, and always executed his responsibilities in an exemplary manner." End quote. We have indeed lost a national son of the soil, and while it is not our will to say when death shall come, and how it takes not just a soul, not just a person, not just a father and a husband, but a formidable statesman, it is significant amidst our loss that we celebrate Ambassador Thomas's life. May his soul rest in peace. Honorable members, I ask that we stand in observance of a minute of silence in the passing of former independent senator and Ambassador Christopher Thomas. Honorable Senators, the clerk will convey to the family of Ambassador Christopher Thomas the sentiments that have been expressed here today. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Honorable Bridget Mary Anisette George, MP, Speaker of the House. Change in membership of Joint Select Committee. I wish to advise that at a sitting held on Friday, November the 12th, 2021, the House of Representatives agreed to the following resolution. Be it resolved that the House of Representatives agreed to the following appointments. Mr. Saddam Hussein in lieu of Mr. Dinesh Rambali on the Joint Select Committee on Finance and Legal Affairs. Mr. Barry Padarat in lieu of Mr. Saddam Hussein on the Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure. Ms. Vandana Mohit in lieu of Mr. Rudinath Indar Singh on the Joint Select Committee on Social Services and Public Administration. Mr. Rudinath Indar Singh in lieu of Mr. David Lee on the Joint Select Committee on State Enterprises. Ms. Anita Haynes in lieu of Mr. Barry Padarat on the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality, and Diversity. Mr. Ravi Ratiram in lieu of Ms. Vandana Mohit on the Parliamentary Broadcasting Committee. Accordingly, I respectfully request that the Senate be informed of this decision at the earliest convenience, please. Respectfully, Speaker of the House, Bridget Mary Anisette George.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives appearing on the supplemental order paper. The Miscellaneous Provisions 2019 Novel Coronavirus 2019 NCOV Vaccination Personnel Bill 2021 in the name of the Attorney General.
Acting Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 62(1)B, I beg to move that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The next stage of the bill will be taken later in the proceedings.
Petitions, papers.
Minister of Social Development and Family Services.
Paper as listed on the order paper in my name. The annual administrative report of the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services for the period 2019-2020.
Of Tourism, Culture and the Arts.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper as listed on the order paper in my name. The annual administrative report of the Ministry of Tourism for the period 2019.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in my name. The annual administrative report of the Evolving Technologies and Enterprise Development Company Limited for the year ended September 30th, 2018. The annual administrative report of the National Flour Mills Limited for the year ended December 31st, 2019. The annual administrative report of the Bureau of Standards for the financial year ended September 30th, 2018. Thank you.
Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the names of the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Planning and Development. The Value-Added Tax Amendment to Schedule 2, Number 2, Order 2021. The reports of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago for the years ended 30th September 2010, 2011, and 2012. The report of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Police Complaints Authority for the year ended September 30th, 2020. The report of the Auditor General on the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the recovery of expenses of the Ministry of Energy and Energy Affairs for the year ended December 31st, 2020. The audited financial statements of National Enterprises Limited for the financial year ended March 31st, 2021. The audited financial statements of Tourism Trinidad Limited for the financial year ended September 30th, 2020. The audited financial statements of National Flour Mills for the financial year ended December 31st, 2020. The audited financial statements of Trinidad Nitrogen Company Limited for the year ended December 31st, 2020. Audited financial statements of the Point Lisas Industrial Port Development Corporation Limited for the year ended December 31st, 2020. The audited financial statements of National Schools Dietary Services Limited for the financial year ended September 30th, 2020. The report on the sixth withdrawal in the amount of $100 million US from the Trinidad and Tobago Heritage and Stabilization Fund in accordance with Section 15.8.3 of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund Act, Chapter 7009 as amended, and the annual report of the Environmental Management Authority for the year ended 2017. I thank you.
Committees.
Senator John.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present the following reports as listed on the order paper in my name. One, the first report of the Public Accounts Committee, first session 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the follow-up on the implementation of the recommendation made in the 25th report of the Public Accounts Committee on an examination of the audited financial statements and internal controls of the National Lotteries Control Board, NLCB, for the years 2008 to 2012. To the second report of the Public Accounts Committee, first session 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the report of the Auditor General on the public accounts of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year 2020. The third report of the Public Accounts Committee, first session 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the follow-up on the implementation of the recommendations made in the 22nd report of the Public Accounts Committee on the examination of the audited financial statements of the Telecommunications Authority of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial years 2010 to 2016. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Mark.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present the following reports as listed on the order paper in my name. The first report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, first session, 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on a summary of inquiries undertaken during the 11th Parliament for the period 2015-2020. The second report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, first session, 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the efficiency of the delivery of services to the public by the regional health authorities, and a follow-up on the implementation of the recommendations presented in the Welch report. Second, in the Welch report, yes, let me see if I think I missed something here, that's all. Yeah. May I repeat that, Mr. Vice President? The second report of the Public Administration and Appropriation Committee, first session, 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the efficiency of the delivery of services to the public by the regional health authorities, and a follow-up on the implementation of the recommendations presented in the Welch report, first session, 12th Parliament. The third report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, first session, 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the follow-up on the implementation of the recommendations of the 24th report of the PAAC on the examination into the processing of the payment of pensions and gratuities of retired public officers and contracted employees, first session, 12th Parliament. And finally, the interim report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, first session, 2020-2021, 12th Parliament, on an examination of the response of public authorities to the COVID-19 pandemic in Trinidad and Tobago, first session, 12th Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Minister of Social Development and Family Services.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed in the order paper in my name. The first report of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity on an inquiry into the right to equal access to education with specific focus on the underperformance of schools in the Port of Spain and environs district. With respect to performance in terminal examinations, second session, 2021-2022, 12th Parliament.
Senator Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. To the Minister of Health, given the statement by the President of the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association that patient care is being compromised owing to a critical shortage of specialized ICU nurses, can the Minister state what is being done to address the issue?
Health, thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Good afternoon to you and good afternoon to members of this honorable chamber. The Ministry of Health started proactively to recruit ICU nurses in 2020. We recruited 7 from Cuba in 2020 and 18 more in 2021. In addition, we started local training of our RNs. In 2020, we trained 196, and a cohort right now is being trained of 100. The ratios of nurses to patients at CUVA in our ICU and HCU are as follows. In our ICU, it is 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, depending on how many patients occupy the 28 ICU beds. And at the HDU, where you need a slightly lower level of care, it is 1 to 4. In addition, in managing a pandemic in scarce resources, when I visited CUVA, there was no centralized e-monitoring system. We installed that. We have a centralized e-monitoring system with nurses, consultants, and registrars, where the following vitals are monitored electronically to compensate for the human deficiency: arterial blood pressure, SpO2, pulse rates, and cardiac rhythms. When any of these patients decompensate, alarms will ring in this centralized e-monitoring system, which is located in the cold zone, and the appropriate human resources and medical resources are sent to these patients. That way, we ensure that the quality of care is optimized and not unduly compromised in this time of scarce resources. So we acted proactively, Mr. Vice President, since 2020 in bringing in ICU nurses and training our ICU nurses and marrying that with technology to optimize care. Thank you very much.
Senator Ma?
Yeah. Mr. Vice President, can the minister indicate, based on the statement made by the president of the TNT Registered Nurses Association, whether there is any compromising taking place with the quality of health care extended to patients who are presently located at the ICU level at the hospitals in our country.
Thank you very much. In speaking to the general managers of nursing and to the nursing manager at CUVA, this is not my words. They have assured me that the quality of care is not unduly compromised.
Can the minister therefore explain what factors may be responsible, Mr. Vice President, for the recent upsurge in the deaths of citizens, particularly those who are in the ICU unit? Can the minister share with us what could be the factors responsible for this situation, having regard to what he has just explained to us?
I won't allow that question, Senator Mark.
I would love to answer it.
All right, well, you say you wouldn't allow it, so. Is that all?
Questions for oral answer.
Honorable Senators, before I call on the Leader of Government Business, permit me to remind you that an errata in relation to question number 1 on the order paper for questions for oral answer was sent out yesterday. For those who may not have seen it or had sight of it, you can find it on your rotunda. Leader of Government Business.
Madam, Mr. Vice President, there are 7 questions on notice for oral response, and the government will be answering all 7. There are 2 questions for written response, and the responses to those 2 questions, number 12 and 13, have been submitted to the clerk. Thank you.
Senator Nakid.
President, question number 1 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. The Minister of National Security is wholly unaware that any such directive was given by any authorized government official. However, it should be noted that the TT Travel Pass instructions are clear and unambiguous, and as soon as a person logs on to the TT Travel Pass website, a pop-up window appears with a statement in bold print, and I quote, "The PCR test must be in English only," unquote. Any competent, reasonable person completing the travel pass process therefore must, of necessity, be aware of this requirement, and it is difficult to understand why any such person would not have recognized and would not have known this. Thank you, Mr. President.
First supplementary.
Mr. Vice President, since the Minister of National Security has said he was wholly unaware, it has been stated by no less than the President of the Trinidad and Tobago Hockey Board, who is also the Chairman of Sport TT.
Senator Naked, question. You have to
Question
pose a
being that our national junior team was seated in the plane. Who else other than the Minister of National Security or someone in that office could have caused them to deplane at that point in time?
So what is the question
The
specifically
question
to the
is,
Minister of National Security?
how can the Minister of National Security be unaware of a directive that can only be issued by his ministry?
I repeat,
Minister of National Security.
I am not aware that any official authorized government personality would have issued such a directive.
Senator Naked, any more supplementaries?
Yes, Mr. Vice President. Then can the Minister of National Security detail briefly for this honorable chamber, is there any other ministry other than the Ministry of National Security that has the power to say yea or nay to a national team already planned and about to enter Trinidad with all necessary documents? Just a simple question.
Minister of National Security.
The senator describes it as simple. I would describe it as indecipherable. I don't understand this question, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Naked, any other supplementaries?
Given the obvious bewilderment that the Honorable Minister finds himself with a very clear question,
Ask the question, Senator Naked.
is
Get
he
to the
prepared
question.
as the Minister of National Security, who put eventually our national team through this tragic ordeal, is he prepared to apologize to the parents and players of the national
I
team?
won't allow that question, Senator Naked. Any other supplementaries?
Yes. Mr. Vice President, has the Minister of National Security, who stated that, and I quote, the authorities acting on behalf of TT, if they have a problem in interpreting something, a document, it will make no sense
So
to have
Senator
someone...
Naked, Senator Naked, you have to ask the question, you have to get to the
Can
question
I preface
quicker.
it, Mr.
So
Vice
no,
President?
there's no need for a preamble. Get to
Okay.
the question to ask the
Can
Minister.
the Minister of National Security indicate that the unfortunate policy of not having a foreign language speaker within the office that eventually turned back the national team, has that been corrected?
I won't allow that question, Senator Naked. Next question on the order paper. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 2 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
And Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, as has been said numerous times before and will be repeated here today, the shareholders of Train 1 continue to be in discussions as to the future of all of Atlantic LNG's operations, which would include the sharing of costs, income, cargoes, and other related items going forward.
Senator Mark?
Can the minister indicate whether this plant will be mothballed, given the statement recently made by the Prime Minister?
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Mr. Vice President, as been stated before, we continue to be in discussions with respect to the whole of Atlantic LNG. Anyone with any ounce of engineering would understand Train 1 being the first plant, the first train in an LNG facility built. There are certain engineering parts that must continue, that 2, 3, and 4 are appended to. So these conversations and discussions continue despite the ramblings of the opposition.
Senator Mark, any more supplementary?
So, is the minister indicating to this Honorable Senate that based on pending discussions, there is a possibility for this plant to continue in operation in the foreseeable future, Mr. Vice President?
Minister.
Mr. Vice President, I cannot predict the future. As I said, we continue. It's not pending discussions. It is continuing discussions, discussions that are current and continuing. And at the appropriate time, when decisions are finally made, the country will be told the decisions.
Senator Mark.
Could the minister share with the Senate whether the discussions that are continuing centers around the non-availability of gas for Train 1, Mr. Vice President?
Allow that question, Senator Mark. Next question. Next supplementary, if you have one.
Can the minister categorically state whether Train 1 will eventually die?
I won't allow that question either, Senator Mark. Next question on the order paper.
Question number 3 to the Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the first point is NGC's funding towards Atlantic Train 1 was for turnarounds and not to upgrade the train, as is being professed by the UNC opposition. So NGC's funding towards Atlantic Train 1 in 2021 was for a turnaround to ensure that the train was in a state of readiness and, importantly, safe to operate and accept gas for processing. Per the terms of its supply contracts with upstream suppliers, NGC has an obligation to take gas or pay for the product it does not take, known as a take or pay contract. In 2021, NGC was potentially faced with upstream gas supply commitments in excess of guaranteed downstream demand, given possible plant shutdowns and sustained reduced industrial activity due to COVID-19. In addition, at the end of 2020, NGC was still in commercial negotiations with several large consumers as they were seeking contract terms that were uneconomical to NGC over the long term. Therefore, NGC had no firm contractual obligations to several of the large downstream plants in the petchem sector. Given the drastic decline in commodity prices in 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic and fears of the second and third waves of COVID impact on reduced industrial demand in 2021, several of the downstream plants could have made the decision to shut down their operations, at least temporarily, rather than purchase this gas. This would have resulted in continued losses for NGC. There existed the possibility for NGC to monetize volumes not taken by the petchem plants to Train 1 for LNG production. In fact, one of the companies opted to shut down 2 of its plants in April 2021. Inasmuch the company would have been billed for its upstream commitments, it made commercial sense to find an alternative use for the volumes not taken up by the downstream petchem industry. This would yield incremental revenue for NGC and maximize the commercialization of Trinidad and Tobago's natural gas resources. Additionally, Mr. Vice President, if Train 1 was closed in 2020, it would also have had an adverse impact on the complex negotiations between government and the shareholders, thereby placing the people of Trinidad and Tobago, who ultimately are the shareholders, in a disadvantageous position in the long term regarding its shareholding, which is critical revenue stream for Trinidad and Tobago as its citizens. The second part of the question, the answer is NGC only remitted $32.4 million to Atlantic for Train 1 2021 expenditure, including this turnaround, and there was no upgrade.
Mr. Vice President, given the fact that over 200 million of Trinidad and Tobago dollars was spent on this turnaround, can the minister indicate, given the failure of this exercise, who will be held accountable and culpable for this wastage of expenditure? Can the minister clarify that? For this
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I stood in this booth not too long ago and explained to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that for the first time ever in its history, NGC had suffered a loss on its financial accounts. I take the opportunity to remind the people of Trinidad and Tobago that out of that loss, over $2 billion, not $200,000, $2 billion had to be written off by NGC because of the only energy transaction negotiated by the UNC between 2010 and 2015, a bad deal that in the last financial year cost the NGC $2 billion. I would like to know who will be held accountable for that bad negotiation and the only energy transaction ever negotiated by a UNC government between 2010 and 2015.
Could I ask the Honourable Minister, seeing that he has raised this point, whether the Minister of Energy and the Prime Minister are culpable and accountable for the fiasco that has visited NGC because of your sellout in the negotiation with these companies that resulted in this deterioration?
Senator Mark, I'm on my legs.
Say it outside.
Senator, Minister, members. Senator Mark, please take a seat. Please take a seat. There's a chair in the booth. Please take a seat. Minister, do the same, please. We are at the point of dealing with oral answers to questions. This type of back and forth will not be tolerated. You ask a question and you answer your question succinctly. There will be no quips and barbs thrown at each other. That would end up in the decorum or the dignity of this chamber being lowered. As we go forward, ask succinctly, answer succinctly. Continue. Do you have another supplementary question? That question that you just asked is not allowed. Do you have another supplementary question?
Mr. Vice President, we would like the Honourable Minister to indicate to the Senate, through you, who will be held accountable for the over $250 million.
Senator Mark, that question was asked and answered already. Do you have a fourth and final to this question?
What role did the Minister of Energy, who is before us today, played in the negotiations between the upstreamers and the NGC that has resulted in this matter that the NGC now faces?
That question,
can the minister indicate to us
that
what
question will
role
not
he
be
played?
allowed, Senator Mark. Next question on the order paper.
Question number 4 to the
Minister of Energy and Energy
Minister of
Industries.
Energy and Energy Industries.
Mr. Vice President, whilst NGC stands by its decisions, which were made after due diligence and analysis of the best information available at the time, it must be recognized that other strategic considerations surrounding Train 1, which impacted the wider Atlantic unitization discussions, which to date are ongoing between government and global multinational oil companies, and which are outside the control of the NGC board, can have impacted on the future of the train and the entire Atlantic facility. It is accepted business practice in circumstances such as these that the board members be indemnified for decisions taken in good faith after appropriate due diligence. Further, NGC remitted $224 million to Atlantic for Train 1 in 2021 expenditure, including Train 1's turnaround cost, and not $440 million. It is unfortunate that the actual cost of this exercise continues to be grossly misrepresented and inflated by members of the opposition UNC.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, can the minister categorically say to the Senate through you whether the board of directors of both the NGC and the NGC LNG were granted personal indemnity by the cabinet and or government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago? Can he clear that matter up for this honorable Senate?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. As has been stated in the other place before, and I am happy to state it here again, the answer is no. No indemnification has been granted by the Cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago. However, if such an occasion arises, it will be given due consideration by the Cabinet, as all matters are.
May I ask, Mr. Vice President, through you, whether the minister can share with this honorable Senate whether any such proposal has reached the desk of the Minister of Energy or the government seeking personal indemnification of the directors of NGC and NGC LNG.
Minister.
Mr. Vice President, as I believe has been stated before, both by the Minister of Finance as well as the former Minister of Energy before my time, such discussions may have taken place, but as I said, at the appropriate time, if necessary, the Cabinet will give all matters due consideration.
Mr. Vice President, may I ask through you to the Honorable Minister, if the Cabinet were to grant such indemnification, would the Minister not agree with me that would be equivalent to misbehavior and misconduct in public office? Can I ask the Honorable Minister?
Senator Mark, I will not allow that question. Next question. Supplementary, if you have it.
Mr. Vice President,
there's no more.
Can the Honorable Minister indicate to this Honorable House whether he can provide us in writing the name of the contractors and service providers who enjoyed, Mr. Vice President, this sum involving over $200 million of taxpayers' dollars for the turnaround of Train 1? Can he provide us in writing?
I won't allow that question, Senator Mark. Next question on the order paper, Senator Lochmidial. You could stay there and ask.
Question number 25 to the Minister of Health.
Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, Mr. Vice President. The number of positive COVID-19 samples that have been tested for the variant, that is the Delta variant, as of September 25th, 2021, is 1,482. And the criteria being used to test all variants, including the Delta variant, are as follows. A, all persons locally having entered or belonging to migrant populations with a positive COVID-19 test result. B, all repatriated persons arriving with a positive test result. C, fully vaccinated individuals with a cycle threshold or CT value of less than 20. D, any clusters from a community case with a cycle threshold CT value of less than 20. And E, requests from health institutions, both in the public and private sectors, where patients fit the criteria as outlined in the Ministry of Health's protocols.
Senator Lakshmi Dayal.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Honourable Minister, earlier this year, in April of this year, when we had the entry of the P1 variant, you told this Honourable House that the genetic sequencing testing was a project of the University of the West Indies, and that the ministry had pledged financial assistance, as well as they were in talks with the British High Commission to increase the testing capacity at the University of the West Indies. Can the Minister give this Honourable House an update on those measures to increase the testing capacity for genetic sequencing at the University of the West Indies?
Sure.
Minister of Health.
So the Ministry of Health we promised, and we did give that department at UB $500,000. That was able to purchase genomic sequencing equipment to increase the capacity from 5 at a time, because they were doing, it kind of like a pregnancy test cartridge where you put in 5 samples, to almost increase that by a factor of 20. So that was the contribution of the Ministry of Health. CARFA also donated other equipment to the University of the West Indies. The Public Health England donation, I will have to check on that one. But the capacity at UB has significantly increased from 5 at a time to now the value of hundreds.
Senator Lakshmi, Senator Gopi Singh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Honorable Minister, would you be able to kindly, if you can, give an idea of the percentage of positive cases that go for screening for the Delta variant? If you have 100, about how many will go to UWI and to CARFA for the screening for Delta variant, admitting that not all go?
Okay, so that question does not appreciate the process for screening, so I will inform the Honourable House. CARFA is the collection agency for all samples from CARICOM that do not have individual capacity. They collect the samples. CARFA then sends the samples to UWI, so CARFA doesn't test. UWI does the testing for the CARICOM region. So it's not to say that CARFA does testing and UWI does testing. So all the samples we send that fit the criteria are sent to CARFA. CARFA in turn sends it to the University of the West Indies for testing. All 100% that meets the criteria.
Senator Gopi Singh.
Honourable Minister, would you kindly give us a little idea of what are the criteria that are required for transmission from CARFA to UWI?
I just called it out.
No.
Should I repeat it, Mr.?
Yeah.
Yes. All persons locally having entered or belonging to migrant populations with a COVID-19 test result. B, all repatriated persons arriving with a positive test. C, fully vaccinated individuals with a cycle threshold value of less than 20. D, clusters from the community with a cycle threshold value of less than 20. And requests from health institutions, both in the public and private sectors, where patients fit the criteria as outlined in the Ministry of Health protocols.
Senator Lachmidial.
Honorable Minister, could you just give us an indication, if you can, of the turnaround time for the additional genetic sequencing testing that takes place when a sample is sent from CAFA to UE, where it fits the criteria? What is the turnaround time for that?
What additional testing are we speaking about?
The genetic sequencing testing that you said is taking place at UE.
Yeah.
What's the turnaround time for the results to see whether or not that sample is positive for
Sure.
the Delta variant?
Typically about 24 hours.
And that is in a, sorry.
Go ahead.
That is in addition to the time it takes to get the positive result from CAFA.
No, CAFA does, let me repeat. CAFA does not do the testing. CAFA collects the samples from the CARICOM, as I just explained, and sends to UE for testing. CAFA doesn't test. CAFA collates the samples and sends them to UE for testing. Okay?
That's it?
That's it.
You have one more supplemental, Senator Lachmidial.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Minister.
No, you have one more if you have it to ask.
So in addition, so you're saying that in total, if you have a sample that fits this criteria, what is the average turnaround time for a person who tests? A person presents themselves at a private laboratory, let's say, for testing. What is roughly the turnaround time between that person presenting themselves and getting their final result that they are positive and that they are also positive for the Delta variant?
Right. So you're talking about taking of sample, sending to CAFA, sending to UE, reporting of results. That could take upwards of 24 hours, but the actual turnaround time for the testing is 24. It will depend on the number of tests you have to run. So in other words, UE isn't going to run one sample because it is not a good use of time and so on. So they amalgamate tests. So if you have one test today, one test tomorrow, they might amalgamate. But the turnaround time for testing is 24 hours. The turnaround time from sample taken to results could be upwards of 24 hours, and that is variable.
Okay. Next question on the order paper, Senator Lachmidial.
Thank you. Question number 26 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very warmly, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, as at September the 25th, 2021, there were 37 vacancies on the permanent establishment and 18 vacant contract positions at the Trinidad and Tobago Forensic Science Center. However, there are 26 persons acting in the 37 positions of vacancy on the permanent establishment. In respect of Part 2, the length of time that the positions have been vacant is as follows. Managerial positions between 1 and 2 years. Administrative positions between 5 and 7 years. Professional/technical between 3 months and 9 years. Manipulative between 7 months and 7 years. I thank you warmly, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Lachmidial.
Honourable Minister, in February of this year, the then Minister of National Security indicated that there were plans on the way to bring in forensic pathologists, both under a UNDP program as well as privately, that they were making efforts to recruit. Can the Minister give this House an update on that initiative to recruit more forensic pathologists for the Forensic Sciences Center?
I thank you for the opportunity and happy to advise that since that time, in fact, another forensic pathologist has been hired through the UNDP program of which the member or the senator spoke. And of course, the full complement is 4. We now have 3, and we are aiming to, Mr. Vice President, fill that other vacancy with promptitude. I might advise further that we, the government, recognizing the ongoing circumstance around pathologists, we again are in the process of identifying suitably qualified and ambitioned young citizens of Trinidad and Tobago to whom we would offer scholarships and would be available to fill these vacancies and to keep us sufficiently staffed for the foreseeable future. I thank you.
Senator Gopi Singh.
Mr. Vice President, Honorable Minister of National Security, what steps are being taken by the government to bring back evidential aspects of a criminal case when it is in the hands of a pathologist who is abroad? And for these who are here now, if they leave and go abroad, how does the government or the Ministry of National Security secure either their information on the particular cases? That's the first part I'd like to ask you.
The problem that
question, Senator Gopi Singh. Next question.
Next question?
Yeah, if you have another one.
The issue of the present staff doing criminal cases, how would the state deal with, at the expiration of these contracts, what will happen to the evidence that the pathologists have in their portfolio?
The problem that the senator is alluding to is as old as Methuselah, if you may permit me that kind of metaphor, Mr. Vice President, not new. I suspect it existed from the time we had established a forensic science center, and persons who would have been hired by or contracted by the forensic science center would have retired or demitted office, or left those offices for some other reason. The Evidence Act of Trinidad and Tobago and the current legal arrangements ensure that that is not a problem. The records are able to be read into the courts as part of the evidence. And I know of no case where that has been a problem in respect of the law of evidence.
Senator Lochmidial.
We were informed some time ago of plans for a new forensic science center. Has the ministry undertaken any sort of human resource exercise to estimate the additional staffing that may be necessary when this new center is built, which we were told is about 6 times the size of the existing center? Have you all begun any sort of HR or organizational development type of exercise to determine what would be the staffing requirements when the new center is built and comes on stream?
Minister.
Mr. Vice President, the government is fully aware that a forensic science center is not merely a building, and happily we are in recognition of the fact that a new and modern and digitized operation is necessary, and the senator recognizes that the government is on that path at the very least, and we are doing that. Obviously, in the consideration for that, we recognize that there'll be need for personnel and all of that, and all of these matters quite naturally with this government are in and within our contemplation.
Honorable Minister, would you be kind enough to indicate whether our forensic center is accredited internationally so that we can withstand the scrutiny of the legal processes?
I won't allow that question, Senator Gopi Singh. Next question. Or anybody has? You have another question, Senator? Next question on the order paper.
Question number 27 to the Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, in respect of biological samples, there are really 4 categories that we work with at the Forensic Science Center: biological samples, toxicology samples, narcotic samples, and items for firearm analysis. In respect of the biological samples, on March the 7th, 2018, the biological section was temporarily closed due to health and safety issues such as mold on the walls of that building and the ceiling and other infrastructural deficiencies. Those are the conditions that partly led to our decision to establish a brand new center, as the very senator acknowledged, and we quite proudly a moment ago. Notwithstanding, during this period of closure, the unit continued to receive samples from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Operations, having resolved those problems that temporarily arose, recommenced on a phased basis on October the 4th, 2021. However, as at September the 25th, 2021, the total number of biological samples awaiting processing is 6,983. In respect of toxicology samples, these samples include those from postmortems and blood from Mount Hope and Port of Spain General Hospitals, which were not completed due to the need to conduct repairs to the gas chromatograph equipment. Repairs of this equipment is anticipated to be completed within the next 2 months, and as at September the 25th, 2021, the total number of outstanding toxicology samples is 2,100. In respect of narcotic samples, the very equipment of which I just spoke is also used to process narcotic samples. In the interim, cases are being manually extracted until repairs to this equipment is completed. As at September the 25th, 2021, the total number of narcotic samples awaiting processing is 97. And in respect of items for firearm analysis, prior to February 2021, the Forensic Science Center had 4 scientific officers responsible for processing these. Thereafter, 21 police officers identified in and from the police service were brought to bear an effect at the Forensic Science Center, and 5 forensic analysts, and they were trained in firearm and tool mark examination to alleviate the case backlog and increase the human resource capacity. As at September the 25th, 2021, the total number of items awaiting firearm analysis is 6,920. Mr. Vice President, let me say, in my personal view and as minister, this state of affairs is wholly this state of affairs is undesirable, and I give this Parliament and this country the assurance that once I went to the desk of Minister of National Security, I have taken, am taking regular attention to, with the help of the experts at the Forensic Science Center. We have a program in place ongoing as we speak to eliminate the backlogs of which I just spoke, and we are confident that this process, along with the new digitized platform that we anticipate in the foreseeable future, will deal with this untenable state of affairs that has acquired or become acquired, accumulated over many years. Unsatisfactory, and we are on the job in respect of resolving this. Because we understand, Mr. Vice President, the critical role the Forensic Science Center plays and would continue to play in the entirety of the criminal justice system in Trinidad and Tobago, and there are many criminals to deal with in this land. I thank you.
Senator Lakshmidial.
Minister, based on your response, and specifically with the response in respect of biological samples, is it my understanding that between 2018 and October 2021, there were no biological samples tested at the Forensic Science Center, resulting in this backlog of 6,983?
The Senator wants me to repeat the answer. I was quite clear in my response to the question, Mr. Vice President.
It's up to you.
And in which case, let me read again. On March the 7th, 2018, the biological section was temporarily closed due to health and safety issues, such as mold on the walls and ceiling and other infrastructural deficiencies. Notwithstanding, during this period of closure, the unit continued to receive samples from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Operations recommenced on a phased basis on October the 4th, 2021. However, as at September the 25th, the number of biological samples awaiting processing is 6,983.
During the period March 2018 to October 2021, were any steps taken to facilitate independent testing at private laboratories or so on of these biological samples that were still being received by the Forensic Science Center but which could not be tested?
Minister of National Security.
I am loath to making a clear statement on that matter. That matter can be researched and the information will be made available at the first opportunity to the Senator.
Senator Lakshmidial.
Right, so, Minister, given that there are, in addition to the 6,983 court matters which are probably not progressed due to the non-testing of biological samples, and you mentioned 6,920 firearm analysis cases which are awaiting testing as well, which could also translate into court matters that are awaiting progress in the courts. We know that there is a unit known as CIRU, and you spoke, I think it's Serious Evidence Recovery Unit, which deals with firearm analysis. Could you tell us what determines whether the collection of any items for firearm analysis or shell casings and so on, whether it is sent to CIRU or whether it is dealt with at the Forensic Science Center? Or have those operations been integrated?
Again, as Minister, I don't function at the operational level, but suffice it to say that it is my understanding that CIRU does analysis to demonstrate that the object is or is not a firearm. And the evidence from CIRU is accepted in the courts. And as a consequence, many of the cases that my friend alluded to continue to go through the courts, and the court accepts those bits of evidence as a matter of course.
Senator Lakshmidial.
In respect of ballistic testing and matching and so on, that is done exclusively by the Forensic Science Center in the department to which I alluded a while ago.
Fourth and final question, Senator
Yes.
Lakshmidial.
With respect to financial responsibility, is CIRU funded through the budget for the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service or the budget from the Ministry of National Security allocated to the Forensic Sciences Center?
I won't allow that question, Senator Lakshmidial. That's it.
Introduction of bills. The Trinidad and Tobago Special Economic Zones Bill 2021 in the name of the Attorney General. Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act, Chapter 8811, be now read for a second time.
Sorry, Minister of Labour, could you, once the booth is cleared?
All right. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for the opportunity to contribute to debate on the Foreign Labour Contracts Repeal Bill 2021. The objective of this bill is to repeal the Foreign Labor Contracts Act, Chapter 8811. Mr. Vice President, the Foreign Labor Contracts Act was enacted on February 10, 1900, as the Foreign Labor Contracts Ordinance. At that time, Trinidad and Tobago was still a crown colony of the British Empire with a governor as its head. The underlying reason for the ordinance enacted, Mr. Vice President, was to curb the massed outward migration of laborers from Trinidad and Tobago, which would have threatened the economic stability of the then colony. I am certain that we all are versed in the history of our country, but permit me to paint the historical context that gave rise to this ordinance. The social and economic conditions existing in Trinidad and Tobago at the turn of the 20th century provided the impetus for the introduction of this ordinance by the colonial government. The working class population of Trinidad and Tobago grappled with bleak living conditions, working conditions, low wages, dismal economic prospects in the early 1900s. Many disgruntled laborers began to seek opportunities in other Caribbean islands. Most notably, Mr. Vice President, was the fact that construction began in the nearby Panama on the Panama Canal. And this project drew thousands of West Indian laborers from Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. It is estimated that between 1881 and 1914, a total of 200,000 West Indians made a journey to Panama in hopes of a better life. The debates in the Legislative Council in the 1900s revealed that the Council originally passed the ordinance to prevent immigration from Trinidad and Tobago to the Panama Canal, since at that time it absorbed many of the hands that were needed in Trinidad and Tobago. This mass outward migration threatened the fragile economy of the colony, and as a consequence, the then colonial government sought to control movement of laborers beyond the shores of Trinidad and Tobago. The current act, Mr. Vice President, Section 3, stipulates that an employer or any person acting on behalf of an employer must not, without first having obtained the written leave of the President, hire any person to leave Trinidad and Tobago for the purposes of being employed in a foreign country. A foreign country, Mr. Vice President, is defined under Section 2 as any country not within the Commonwealth and proclaimed to be a foreign country by the President for the purposes of this Act. The consequence of this was that the Act would remain dormant unless brought into force against a particular country that had been proclaimed a foreign country by the President. Mr. Vice President, the Act itself is only 9 sections in length, and an examination reveals that Section 3 in the main Act is really the relevant and pertinent clause that guides this particular Act. This section really said that you could not leave Trinidad and Tobago to go to a non-Commonwealth country to perform works, and the other subsets of the Act laid out the punitive measures that would occur if you did so. So if someone was found to wanting to leave Trinidad and Tobago and did not get the prerequisite approval, then they could be charged $4,500 and 3 months in prison. Additionally, if they tried it a second time they would still pay the $4,500 and spend 3 years in jail. Such was the measure of this act in terms of bringing citizens and towards punitive measures. The act today, should it be put in force, would mean that all nationals willing to take up employment in foreign countries would have to obtain, as a pre-requirement for their departure, the leave of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Vice President, thousands of nationals have in the past, continue today, and would seek in the future to embark on opportunities for their own advancement outside of Trinidad and Tobago. A proclamation under the Act could therefore be an infringement to the fundamental rights of freedom of movement afforded to each citizen of this country. At the time of the ordinance, original enactment, the original wording stated that a foreign country was a country not within Her Majesty's domain. Consequently, Mr. Vice President, the aim was to prevent Trinidad and Tobago laborers from migrating by keeping them within the British Empire and under colonial rule. However, as the former Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, once observed, migration is an expression of the human aspiration for dignity, safety, and a better future. It is part of the social fabric, part of our very makeup as a human family. Whilst it is recognized that this is not an unfettered right, any infringement thereof ought to be, as stated in Section 13 of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, be reasonably justified in a society that has a proper respect for the rights and freedoms of individuals. Trinidad and Tobago has long since broken the shackles of the colonial past, and this year we celebrate 59 years as an independent nation. The last proclamation made under this act declared French Guiana a foreign country in 1946, some 7 decades ago. There are no current proclamations under the act, and thus it is dormant, and so has been for more than half a century. Mr. Vice President, to put it simple, this act is archaic, and its principles in no way reflect the modern democratic reality of Trinidad and Tobago. Since Trinidad and Tobago gained independence in 1962 and became a republic in 1976, there have been no amendments to the act. The act has been absent from the Hansard debates of Parliament, and there has been no recorded public interest with this act. This seriously calls into question the utility and relevance of the act today. Whilst the act has remained stagnant for all these years, Trinidad and Tobago, on the other hand, has developed and progressed significantly since 1900. In the words of William Lacey Swing, former Director General of the International Organization for Migration, migration is not so much a problem to be solved as a reality to be managed. This management must occur within the framework of our fundamental human rights protected at both the international and national levels. Mr. Vice President, on the occasion of Trinidad and Tobago's independence, we became a member state of the United Nations. With membership to this international body, we are bound by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states in Article 13 that everyone has the right to freedom of movement. Furthermore, Trinidad and Tobago is also bound by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of December 21, 1978, which requires countries to respect civil and political rights of individuals, including the right to life, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, electoral rights, and freedom of movement as covered in Article 12. To further buttress the point, the principle of freedom of movement has also been enshrined in the Constitution, and Section 4G states, "It is hereby recognized and declared that in Trinidad and Tobago, they have existed and shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, origin, color, religion, or sex, the following fundamental human rights and freedoms, namely, freedom of movement." As a democratic nation, Trinidad and Tobago is founded on respect for rights and freedoms of the individual. Mr. Vice President, the Act came into force at a time when the colonial government feared that a large immigration from Trinidad and Tobago and outside of the British Empire would severely diminish the labor pool. There was work to be done in the oil fields and on the sugar plantations and cocoa estates, and laborers were needed to do this. The ordinance was therefore the solution chosen by the then colonial government to remedy the problems and challenges faced at that particular time. In the 121 years since the ordinance first enactment, Mr. Vice President, Trinidad and Tobago, and indeed the wider Caribbean, have come together to support and encourage the free movement of skilled and unskilled labor. The CARICOM Single Market and Economy Initiative envisioned an establishment of a common economic zone within the region. One of the fundamental hallmarks of the CSME is the promotion of free movement of skilled community nationals and non-wage earners, either as service providers and/or to establish businesses in the nations and countries with which they choose to reside. In this way, trade and investment is facilitated through the Caribbean, and work permits are rendered obsolete for those within the CARICOM region. Since the 1960s, Mr. Vice President, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has encouraged the free movement of nationals to Canada in order to partake in the Canadian Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. The program provides Canada with a cost-efficient way of sourcing contractual agricultural workers on a seasonal basis to meet the short-term demand for manual labor during the peak planting and harvesting periods. Each year, hundreds of nationals make the journey to Canada for such agricultural work, and the program has been an effective measure in reducing employment within Trinidad and Tobago and addressing the wider issue of poverty. Mr. Vice President, the move to repeal this act is not being made in isolation, and the Ministry of Labor has undertaken extensive consultation with stakeholders. On March 29, 2019, the Ministry hosted a national stakeholder consultation on the review of the Act. Prior to hosting this national consultation, the Ministry sent out invitation letters to 56 stakeholders, inclusive of national and international agencies, government and non-governmental organizations, and to receive comments on the Act. Responses were received from various entities, including the Equal Opportunity Commission, the International Organization for Migration, the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition of Service Industries, the International Labour Organization Decent Work Team and Office of the Caribbean, and the Trinidad and Tobago House of Assembly Division of Community Development, Enterprise Development, and Labor. The majority of responses for this call for comments noted that the Act had no modern relevance to the stakeholder operations. The national stakeholder consultation was attended by 119 persons who represented worker organizations such as the National Trade Union Center, the Joint Trade Union Movement, employer organizations including the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce, the Employers Consultative Association, government agencies, notably the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago, the National Tripartite Advisory Council, the Equal Opportunity Commission, the IOM, and the ILO. At the national consultation, Mr. Vice President, there have been a majority support by stakeholders in favor of the repeal of the legislation based on all of the reasons mentioned earlier. One of the issues that we sometimes forget is that of the 200,000 people who went to the Panama Canal between 1884 and 1914, that approximately 4,500 of our brothers and sisters did not return to their native lands because they died essentially of malaria and/or work and HSE issues in building the canal. So this bill, which was draconian to say the least, really prevented people from looking after their lives or loss of it in one way, and livelihoods. And I think that in 1921, it is really the duty of the government and the opposition to ensure that all citizens have full enjoyment of their fundamental rights and freedoms. Citizens ought to be afforded the choice to pursue employment and other opportunities abroad. As the Indian politician Vayala Ravi once said, migration, whether immigration or return at the micro level, is an individual choice, and government has a role only to facilitate the decision of the individual. As a modern democratic society that has proper respect for the rights of individuals, archaic legislation ought not to remain on our statute books, thereby binding us to our colonial past. We must be progressive, and legislation must respond to and treat with modern circumstances and challenges. This is a move that has the approval of stakeholders, and I therefore strongly urge the members of this Honorable House to support the passage of this bill so as to repeal the Foreign Labor Contracts Act. I thank you, Mr. Vice President, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled an Act to repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act, Chapter 8811, be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The matter that we are addressing, as the Minister has identified, deals with an act that is almost 121 years old, known as the Foreign Labor Contracts Act. Now, no one can argue, Mr. Vice President, that this piece of legislation emerged when Trinidad and Tobago was a crown colony under British colonial rule. Now, the minister did indicate that when we talk about foreign country or foreign countries, the legislation at that time and what is before us only considered Commonwealth or countries within the Commonwealth to really qualify, and laborers would consequently benefit in any kind of outward migration. Now, the minister also indicated, Mr. Vice President, that it was sometime in March of 2019 that a consultation was held to review this act. And he mentioned that over 119 persons participated and a number of organizations. I did not get from the Honorable Minister in his presentation whether the trade union movement represented by JTAM and the National Trade Union Center, what was their position on this particular piece of legislation. My information, and the minister can guide me on this one, was that at the material time when this matter was being reviewed, there was the view expressed that the legislation ought to be amended rather than to be fully repealed. But I stand to be corrected because I did not take part in those consultations that were held in March of 2019. But having regard to what is being proposed here, and again having taken into account, Mr. Vice President, that in a modern democratic state where Trinidad and Tobago has a constitution, there are fundamental rights and freedoms, particularly as it deals with freedom of movement of citizens in and out of our country. The fact that we are a signatory to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and there is a covenant, as the minister said, that addresses at the United Nations level civil and political rights that would encompass all these fundamental freedoms, including movement and assembly. The question is, we are repealing this piece of legislation. But what is the minister putting in place or putting in its place to ensure that the rights, the human rights of workers are in fact safeguarded and protected? Mr. Vice President, we know that in Trinidad and Tobago today, contractors recruiters come to these shores, or today they may be doing it virtually, to recruit our nurses. Even in today's papers, we have the president of the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association speaking to the issue of close to 100 nurses having left this land to go on towards greener pastures. Now, the question that has to be asked is what mechanisms are in place, Mr. Vice President, in this modern period to ensure that workers, laborers, skilled personnel who are leaving our shores to go into other jurisdictions, whether it is the United Kingdom, Mr. Vice President, whether it's the United States, whether it is Canada. What mechanisms, what protocols, what regulations are in place to ensure that the rights of our workers are in fact protected and safeguarded? Mr. Vice President, what kind of relationship do we have with the authorities in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Canada, to ensure that when our people, our professionals leave here, at least their human rights are protected and safeguarded? Mr. Vice President, you know that there are citizens who have left here and they have gone to the Middle East to work, whether in Saudi Arabia, whether in Kuwait. The question again that arises is whether there are mechanisms in place to protect these workers when they migrate to other lands, Mr. Vice President. And we were hoping that the minister would have shared with this Honorable Senate. Yes, there's a proposal before us. There's a policy decision before us in the form of this bill to repeal the Foreign Labor Contracts Act. Yes, that's a fact. But in repealing this particular act, Mr. Vice President, what measures are being put in place to protect the rights of workers? Because, Mr. Vice President, today, the minister made mention of it, migration is a reality that we have to address. We have workers who are being attracted to work in other jurisdictions. And, Mr. Vice President, there are workers who are being contracted to work in our jurisdiction, Trinidad and Tobago. So, in this regard, I would like the Honorable Minister to share with this Senate exactly what mechanisms will the government be putting in place to ensure, Mr. Vice President, that citizens who migrate to work in other jurisdictions, what kind of protection, what kind of mechanism, what kind of protection do we have in place for those workers who are migrating to other jurisdictions? I think this is very critical and very vital for us to understand. And Mr. Vice President, I know that the minister has chosen this piece of legislation. But, Mr. Vice President, there are many other pieces of legislation that we have inherited from the colonial system, from the colonial authorities, that are impacting negatively on the human rights of the citizenry of our country. And I wanted to ask the Honorable Minister, what is the government doing to deal with these matters? So, for example, Mr. Vice President, there is a colonial piece of legislation called Workmen's Compensation Act, the Workmen's Compensation Act. But this is an outdated piece of legislation. And the government should be telling us today through the Minister of Labor, Mr. Vice President, as a colonial relic, does the government intend to repeal that Workmen's Compensation Act and replace it with a modern Employee Injury and Disability Act? I would have thought that the minister would have been doing what I call, or pursuing, Mr. Vice President, a more holistic approach, looking at those pieces of labor legislation that are detrimental to the advancement of the human rights of workers in this land of ours, Trinidad and Tobago. So I asked the minister whether there is any intention on the part of the government to address this particular issue. And Mr. Vice President, the government is moving to repeal this 1900 piece of legislation. But we also have on our books, on our law books, a law called the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act that does not really benefit workers when these workers are retrenched. When companies go into receivership or liquidation, they go home, Mr. Vice President, without any severance payments. So I would like the Honorable Minister, in replying, Mr. Vice President, to tell this Honorable Senate what is in store for workers as it relates to repealing the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, can the minister advise us whether in 2021, we are debating this matter today, whether prior to debating this measure, did the minister engage in any further consultations with the relevant stakeholders? And I'm dealing essentially here with the trade union movement, the labor movement, because this legislation, Mr. Vice President, focus on the working man and woman, focus on the laboring classes, Mr. Vice President. So if this legislation that we are repealing that deals with labor rights or labor relations involving laborers and workers, one would have thought, Mr. Vice President, that our Minister of Labor would have consulted with the trade union movement and to get their thinking on this particular measure that we are dealing with today. Because I listened very closely and carefully to the minister's statement, and nowhere in his statement did he indicate to this Honorable Senate any agreement or disagreement involving NATUC and JTAM and FITONG when they had this consultation in March of 2019 towards this piece of legislation. Did they object? Mr. Vice President, were they in support of the repeal of this legislation? Did they put forward alternative proposals? The minister did not tell us. So we don't know what was the position of the National Trade Union Center on this piece of legislation back in March of 2019. We don't know what is the position of the National Trade Union Center and JTAM and FITONG. And now, Mr. Vice President, in 2021, November, we are repealing this piece of legislation, and we don't know what is the position of the trade union movement. As a matter of fact, Mr. Vice President, I have been advised that the Minister of Labor and his ministry had no consultation whatsoever with the National Trade Union Center and with the joint trade union movement on this piece of legislation that is before us today. Now, Mr. Vice President, in principle, we may not have a difference or a fundamental difference to the matter that is before us, but we must be informed by the thinking and the views of those who are going to be affected either directly or indirectly by what we are debating today. And it is very unfortunate that the government did not find it fit or did not see it fit or appropriate to consult with these very important stakeholders that I've mentioned, JTAM, NATU, and FITOM. The Joint Trade Union Movement, the National Trade Union Center, and the Federation of Independent Trade Unions. So this is a matter of concern to us, and I would certainly like the Honorable Minister to indicate why this matter was not raised with the relevant stakeholders, in this instance, labor. Mr. Vice President, I also would like to ask the Minister, we are repealing this piece of legislation because it is archaic, it is outdated, it is not relevant, particularly in a period of universal declaration of human rights and movement into and out of countries. It is coming at a time, Mr. Vice President, when migration and migrants and migrant workers is on top of the agenda. In fact, Mr. Vice President, I think there are over 200 million people, or even more, in the world today that have left their country to go into other countries through migration in order to find a better life, in search of a better quality of life, in search of a higher standard of living. So that is something that the human spirit will always soar towards. Greater opportunity, greater exposure, so that they can improve their living and their working conditions, that they can improve their quality of life and standard of living. So that is important, Mr. Vice President. But I would like the Minister of Labor to share with this Honorable Senate why in 2021 the government of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Vice President, would have foreigners manning the Boko Reef, the boat called Buko, the ferry, and the APT James, Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President, do you know that it is foreigners who are taking out foreign exchange from our nation treasury, who are now responsible for manning those 2 ferries in our country? And I would like the Minister of Labor to explain to this Honorable Senate, as we deal with this question of foreign labor contracts, is the Minister aware that there are foreigners in Trinidad and Tobago operating on these ferries between Scarborough and Port of Spain at the expense, Mr. Vice President, of qualified nationals who are trained, who are skilled, who have the talent to run and to manage and to command these ferries that are now under the control of foreigners. So here it is, Mr. Vice President. We are repealing a measure today that deals with foreign labor contracts. And the very government that is seeking to do so are in fact promoting at the same time foreigners over and at the expense of nationals of Trinidad and Tobago. So what do we have, Mr. Vice President? Do we have colonialism in reverse? Have we just gotten rid of the British colonialists and we have replaced them with Trinidad and Tobago colonialists? What's going on? This is a very serious matter. And I would like the Minister of Labor to share with us what is going on. Mr. Vice President, do you know that in our country today, you have a work permit arrangement that allows a company to bring in a stranger, a foreigner, into our country and to work for 28 consecutive days, Mr. Vice President, without a work permit? And then they can apply to get a more permanent work permit without any intervention from the workers who are and the unions and the companies that are affected. And these are matters I would have liked the Minister of Labor to address. Because that can happen, Mr. Vice President. What is happening in our country today with foreign workers coming in here to replace nationals cannot take place in the United States, cannot take place in England, cannot take place in Canada. But we in Trinidad and Tobago are facilitating these foreigners coming here on contract and they are replacing our nationals. So it is a bit contradictory. It is almost ironic that we are debating a bill that is going to replace, Mr. Vice President, a system that seeks to grant permission, formally from the governor in the current legislation, the president. You must get the express permission from the president to go and work in another country that is not within the Commonwealth of Nations. That is what we are addressing today, Mr. Vice President. And we have, as I said, a very unfortunate situation that is occurring simultaneously in our country and our nation, Mr. Vice President. So yes, we understand, what was taking place. We understand why, this is taking place and this has been taking place. But Mr. Vice President, when you go through the legislation, you realize that even though we were under colonial rule, and even though you were prohibited in moving without the express permission of the president. The reality is that the laborer had a contract that was drawn up, and that contract that was drawn up in the legislation that we are about to repeal provides certain conditions that the employer or the agent of the employer must have met, must have satisfied in order for him to get that laborer out of Trinidad and Tobago into another non-Commonwealth jurisdiction. I remember looking at some literature, Mr. Vice President, on this very bill that this very act that we are about to repeal. And some of the countries that the government at that time, the colonial government, prohibited any recruitment of labor going to Liberia, Brazil. I saw Curacao, which they called the Netherlands, West Indies at the time. I saw French Guyana at that time, because they were not within the Commonwealth, Mr. Vice President. And therefore proclamations were made seeking to ensure that laborers do not go to those countries. And if they did go, Mr. Vice President, they had to get the express permission of the governor and, under the independent Trinidad and Tobago, the president of our country. So these were some of the challenges that we had to face. And as the Minister of Labor shared with us, Mr. Vice President, the living and working conditions at the time when this colonial legislation was formulated and promulgated were very, very harsh, very oppressive, very dismal for the people at that time. The literature is revealing that at that material time, Mr. Vice President, the population in 1888, 1894, 1900 was just about 270,000 citizens who occupied space in our land called Trinidad and Tobago at that time. And we were developing the oil industry at that material time. The plantations were still in existence at that point in time because slavery and the slave trade had been abolished in 1834 and formally abolished in 1838. And within that period of 1838 and 1900, when this bill came, when this ordinance was proclaimed and promulgated, the then colonial authorities sought to attract the Portuguese to come in as laborers to replace the African slaves who had gained their freedom through the abolition of the slave trade. And they went on to see if they could attract the free Africans from Africa and from the Americas to come and work here. At that time, Mr. Vice President, they also brought the Chinese at that time. But they were no substitute for the Africans as a result of the abolition of the slave trade at that particular point in time. So you know, Mr. Vice President, what the colonialists had to do in order to continue their exploitation and oppression of the people to extract wealth for their United Kingdom at that time, because they were the colonialists. They went to India and they brought indentured laborers. So the indentured replaced the slaves on the plantation who allowed their freedom after blood, sweat, and tears and major struggles. And as the minister shared with us, many people, Mr. Vice President, left here. In fact, the literature is showing that between the period 1888 to about 1914, over 200,000 West Indians left the West Indies, including Trinidad and Tobago, to go and work on the railways and to build the Panama Canal at that time. Over 200,000 people left. And again, Mr. Vice President, it had to do with the fact that people were seeking new opportunities.
Mr. Vice President, on a point of order, please.
To improve their quality of life.
Mr. Vice President, on a point of order, please. I think the Minister of Labour would have gone through a lot of this, and I'm just wondering the relevance of the present speaker, Standing Order 46.1, the relevance of his contribution to this debate.
Mr. Vice President.
Yes, Senator Mark, so you are skirting quite wide in relation to responding to what the Minister of Labour would have spoken about in his contribution. So I'd ask you to tighten it up and come back in to what we're dealing with here, which is the repeal of that act.
Mr. Vice President, I just want to bring to your attention.
Senator Mark, 1 second, and responding specifically to what the Minister of Labour would have indicated in his contribution. Continue.
I don't know if you remember, and I don't know if my friend who raised that standing order, which, as I said, I am obeying what you have said, but I just want to advise Mr. Vice President. The Minister of Labour made reference to the Panama Canal. So I am responding to that matter by just elaborating on the experience that we had and why, for instance, at the particular time, the bill that is before us, that is seeking to repeal the act, prohibited people from leaving Trinidad and Tobago. And the minister indicated that the foreign, when they talk about foreign, they were referring to non-Commonwealth countries. You couldn't leave Trinidad and Tobago unless you were going to a Commonwealth country. So I was just elaborating on what the minister himself had shared with this Honorable Senate. I believe that my colleague is not aware of this historical context and experience that we have been, we have been exposed to as a nation. So, Mr. Vice President, I will proceed according to your intervention. I want to indicate, Mr. Vice President, that given the current situation that we are faced with in Trinidad and Tobago, I think that we need to get legislation to facilitate the migration of citizens with the relevant protections to other lands. Mr. Vice President, just as in the 1800s and 1900s, today Trinidad and Tobago has high levels of unemployment in our land. We have high levels of poverty in our land. We have people crying out for greater opportunities in order to gain and improve their quality of life. Mr. Vice President, I don't know if you're aware, but today as we speak, there are close to 8,000 UE graduates who are unemployed in our country.
You have 5 more minutes.
Mr. Vice President, do you know this? As a former graduate of UE, I am a former graduate of UWI. We have over 8,000 people under this government who are unemployed and they are skilled. So I really want to appeal to the Minister of Labour to bring legislation to protect these individuals who may wish to migrate to Canada or migrate to the United States or the United Kingdom. But you have to give them some level of protection because the government of this country has failed to provide the kind of employment opportunities for our citizens. Mr. Vice President, I do have to tell you what has happened in the last few years in this country with the shutting down of Petrotrin, as an example, and so many thousands of workers.
Senator Mark. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of going quite broad in relation to this piece of legislation that is before us. Again, confined your comments to either respond to what the Minister of Labour has put forward or just move on to another point.
President, I know I only have about a few minutes again, about 3 minutes by now. Mr. Vice President, I would like the Minister in his winding up to explain to this Honorable Senate, if I may just summarize as I bring my contribution to a close. I would like the Minister to indicate what exactly is he replacing this piece of legislation. What is the replacement? We are repealing, but what is the replacement for the repeal? I would like the Minister to share with us what is the replacement. And can the Minister share with us, Mr. Vice President, the other pieces of colonial relics called statutes that are now burdening our statute books in this country and that is detrimental, in fact, these pieces of legislation are essentially archaic, Mr. Vice President. And I hope that the Minister will do something about repealing these pieces of legislation so that the human rights and fundamental freedoms consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights would in fact be given its full manifestation and also flourish at the same time. Mr. Vice President, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to really contribute to this piece of legislation that is before us, but I await the Minister providing further clarity on some of the issues that we have raised here on this matter so that we can understand exactly where the government's policy is going as it concerns the protection of workers who have to migrate to other countries. And Mr. Vice President, in closing, may I ask through you to ask the Minister to let us know what is happening to ILO Convention 143 that deals with migrant workers. We want to know whether the government is about to ratify Convention 143 and Convention 129 dealing with seafarers. These are very important conventions that will deal with the rights of workers in our country. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Senator Lachmidial.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me to contribute to this debate on very short two-clause bill brought here to revoke to repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act. Indeed, as it has been described, one of the colonial relics that remain on our statute books, not really applicable to, or not being used, and really out of touch and not applicable to what our modern society views as labor issues. But, Mr. Vice President, let me just say, and I will pick up a little bit on what Senator Mark spoke about without repeating it, but this is a lost opportunity, really, to be proactive and bring modern, state-of-the-art legislation to deal with labor issues which are inherently linked and arise as a result of migration. There are many labor issues which currently exist in our country and around the world. And some of those issues have really been exacerbated in recent times by the COVID-19 pandemic. Increasing poverty, job loss, lost opportunities, and so on has really forced a lot of migration. But not just COVID. We've seen, for example, where you have ethnic conflict in various countries, you've seen mass migration. And once you have mass migration taking place around the world, you are going to have labor issues because, of course, migrants would, not just move around to find somewhere to live, but they have to work and they have to earn a living. And, of course, a big part of the problem that migration would pose to any country that is the receiver of migrants would be the impact on the labor markets and how you deal with those situations. Now, this particular piece of legislation that is being repealed here today didn't really treat with migrants coming into the country. It dealt with, at the time, persons trying to leave the country for greener pastures. But as I said before, simply coming to say, well, we don't need that anymore, and we're revoking it, we're repealing it, really misses the mark, in my view, because what we really ought to have had, if we went to great lengths to have public consultation and so on this, it ought to have been addressed in the minds of some of those 119 people who attended that consultation and that whole list of people who attended and organizations that were represented, that modern legislation to deal with labor issues as it pertains to migrants really is something that we need to have. So just as the colonial masters, would have looked at labor flight and so on, and there was many mega projects taking place during the period of time that this law was really being used, we too have to look at how the regulation of the labor market and migration can really, how it impacts upon us protecting the human rights of our citizens as well as those who may be coming into the country, how you want to treat with issues linked to migration and the labor force, such as the proliferation of human trafficking, and that's a phenomenon that we are constantly battling with in this jurisdiction due to the influx of migrants. And you also have to consider things like forced labor, specifically as it relates to the more vulnerable populations, young people, women, and so on. You have issues as well that are globally recognized, such as equality of pay. Are you creating a situation when you have migrant labor coming in or going out where people are providing an alternative workforce, a cheaper labor force, which is exactly what happened in the 1900s. You were looking for the cheap, most affordable labor to work here, and you didn't want them to leave because you were able to exploit them. The colonial masters were able to exploit them here. What we don't want to happen now is that you have people here now exploiting another group of migrants, or that our own people seeking greener pastures, because of course we are, and I don't think anybody can deny it, we are in difficult economic times. And when our citizens choose to leave, of course we don't want a piece of legislation that says you can't leave unless the Queen or the President or the Governor General or anybody tells you can leave, but you want to have systems in place to understand that they will not be susceptible to hardship, to being, ripe prospects for exploitation when they travel to foreign lands, simply because the labor market in Trinidad and Tobago, the economy and the situation that they find themselves in is not the best at the moment. So, whilst the Act is a colonial relic, however, there were protections included in that law, and I have to make specific mention, as outdated as they are and inapplicable as they may be now, Sections 5B of this law that we are repealing, for example, dealt with the ability of a labourer to sue on a breach of his labour contract. Very important. Again, outdated, but it is something that we can look to include in a modern piece of legislation. How does a labourer recruited by an international recruiter going to work on an oil rig somewhere in Central America, which we have people doing, I actually know someone quite well who does that, 6-month contracts abroad working on rigs and so on. If his contract is breached in some way, what is the recourse? Can he, who is liable? And this piece of law, as outdated as it was in 1900s, had something that called a surety, and it was basically a mechanism put there to ensure that the labourer who found himself, on the bad end of a deal or something like that of a contract, would have some recourse against someone, whether it be the recruiter, the employer, whoever it is. We have to remember that sometimes our own citizens who may leave this country to go abroad to work, they may not be familiar with the laws, they may not have the funding and so on to be able to navigate the legal systems in the country in which they go to. Where can they enforce that contract? Would they have any recourse in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago? Would they have recourse in a court abroad? What kind of assistance would be available to them? Those are all questions that you want to consider when you're simply repealing a law that offered some level of protection, albeit not sufficient and, again, not really modern in its formulation, but you still want to have questions like those answered. The law that we are repealing also went on to specify what should be included in a labour contract when someone was being recruited to go abroad.
Senator Lakshmi Dayal, 1 second. So I'm allowing you to develop the context by which you're going into what we're debating here today, but I do not want you to go too far into the legislation itself that we're repealing, because it starts to take on an act of redebating that legislation. I understand the points that you're making. Make them succinctly, specifically because you end up also repeating what both the Minister of Labour and the Senator Mark has said in rebuttal to that. Don't go over it too much. If you have new points, bring those forward and try not to redebate the act that we're repealing too much.
Understood. Thank you. And so, yes, Mr. Vice President, so I'll just quickly say that Sections 7 and 8 of the Act we're repealing deals with what the contract should include, as well as the explanation of the contract. And why those things are important, again, it's because the persons who are most vulnerable and who require protection from a law like this, or a modern version of this law, would really be people who may not understand the terms and conditions that they're going to. I'm sure most of us growing up would have heard the anecdotal stories of indentureship. Our foreparents who were promised, this land of milk and honey that they were coming to, and when they came here, they found out that the contracts weren't really, what they were, the terms and conditions that they had to work under weren't what was didn't really materialize when they got here. What they met here was something completely different, and the ability for repatriation and all of that. And we've heard these things over and over. We taught it in history. We don't want history to repeat itself in a modern version of that, where persons are entering into labour contracts to go abroad and they do not understand the context. And I'll get into some examples of countries that have legislation that deal exactly with these things in a modern way. So that we agree, and I agree, that a restriction of movement that is in Section 3 of this clause really does not align with the rights and privileges under our Republican Constitution. But we cannot ignore those protections and the need to, have to highlight the migration issues and the need to institute labor protection. The minister made reference, and I wasn't aware of the statistic, I had heard of it, but I wasn't aware that almost 4,500 people had died, of our nationals had died in the construction of the Panama Canal when this law that we are repealing was in effect. Again, that really does highlight why we should not simply be repealing, but replacing. Because if it was HSE issues and health issues like malaria, I think it was, he said, that resulted in 4,500 of our nationals dying abroad, then that in itself is the justification for why this should be a repeal and replace, and not simply a repeal of an existing law. Now, I just want to get a little bit into the issue of why it is so important to have this, and it really is found if you look at the statistics worldwide. Of course, we have a little challenge locally in terms of making these arguments in a local context because of the unavailability of statistics. But what applies around the world, certainly we can extrapolate from it and know that how pertinent it would be here. The International Labour Organization estimates that about 169 million migrant workers exist around the world, and about that constitutes almost 5% of the labor force. So migrant labor, people who leave their home country and go abroad to work or are forced to migrate because of war, famine, poverty, whatever it is, or just simply seeking better opportunities. That's about 5% of the global workforce. I found a 2021 document from the International Labour Organization called Global Estimates on International Migrant Workers. And interestingly, what I found in that report, and they mentioned, is that there's an increased percentage, whereas the majority of migrant labor is between the 25 to 69, what they call the normal adult population. The size of that grouping of younger persons below the age of 25 is actually increasing. So what you're seeing now is a trend where more young people are also joining that, what we call the migrant labor workforce. Again, to me, this underscores the need for... Mr. Vice President, I rise on a point of order, 46.1. While we appreciate the senator placing this in a historical context, I would prefer. I'm sure the senators, this Senate would prefer if she stay within the parameters of the bill.
So, Senator Lachmidial, again, I'm trying to find where you're going in relation to what you're saying.
Can I explain? Sorry. Can I say? Well, it's not historical. It's actually this year, 2021 data that I'm referring to. And where I'm going with it is I'm going with why bring a two-clause bill to repeal an existing law and not replace it in the context of the importance of having modern legislation to govern migrant labor. That is the point.
Okay, so I understand that point. Now, understand what I am saying in the sense that repeal and replace is a point that has been brought up, one by the speaker before you, and that's why I'm indicating too that if you have new points, bring them forward specifically, because what you're doing is you're coming with data to make a point that has already been made before. So if you're going along the lines of repeal and replace again, there's no need to come with all of the data and all of the information that you have, because that point has been made and you will run afoul of the standing order in relation to tedious repetition. If you have new points, bring them forward now. Continue.
But Mr. Vice President, I know we aren't very data-driven in our approach, which is probably why we are repealing and not replacing. I would just want to say that with respect to the protection of human rights, there are several ILO conventions which the United Nations has called upon since the year 2013, when there was international high-level dialogue on international migration and development. They have called upon all countries to implement the relevant ILO conventions which would deal with migrant labor.
Mr. Vice President, please, 46.1, please. The bill is being repealed because it is now irrelevant, and the member is now being irrelevant.
But Mr. Vice President, the bill, I'm trying to make the point that the bill is not irrelevant, and and it's not irrelevant to repeal a piece of legislation and not have something in, and why it is necessary to have legislation like this.
So, Senator Lachmidial, this particular piece of legislation is a tricky one. It's two clauses and it's a repeal. The Minister of Labour, in his contribution, would have given reasons as to why this piece of legislation seeks to repeal. Senator Mark, in his contribution, would have responded to those reasons put forward by the Minister of Labour. The problem that you're encountering is that you are using other pieces of information to repeat what Senator Mark would have indicated. And that is where you're going to run afoul of not just relevance, but tedious repetition. So that is why I'm indicating again for the last time, if you have new points outside of you need to replace instead of just repeal, I invite you to do so now. Otherwise, you're going to continue to run afoul of the standing orders.
I understand everyone isn't very comfortable with academia, but let's just get on with it then. Legal migration, Mr. Vice President, and legal channels that are regulated properly for migration could actually affect labor market needs, and they should reflect the labor market needs. What we are...
It's either that I am not being clear. So we're not talking about labor market needs, and we're not talking about repeal and replace again. Do you have new points to bring forward in relation to anything that the Minister of Labour has said outside of what has been already responded to by Senator Mark? If you have new points, bring it forward now so that you can continue in your contribution. If not, then you're going to run afoul of the standing orders. It's a very tight piece of legislation.
Mr. Vice President, can I go through some examples then of countries that have legislation that deal with these issues?
That's the thing, Senator Lakshmi. There's no need to go through examples of countries that deals with that. Senator Mark dealt with it in terms of the need to replace it with something else. You cannot go through that in terms of examples of countries that have legislation that may have or may not have replaced this piece of legislation that we're trying to repeal. And that's why I'm indicating to you, you need a new point. If you have a new point, by all means, you may continue. If not, well, then you have to decide how it is that you're going to couch this or bring this across so that at least it brings something new to the debate.
Well, Mr. Vice President, I would simply say that it's a complete and utter waste of parliamentary time to repeal a piece of legislation and not propose something new to deal with serious issues that affect this government, but clearly the government isn't interested in hearing about proposals for a modern piece of legislation that deals with labor issues in this country. They are quite content to note that migrants, given the extenuating financial circumstances they find themselves due to the mismanagement of the economy by the government, might be fleeing our shores to seek opportunities abroad and would have absolutely no protection under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Senator Dayal Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for allowing me to partake in this.
Can you please use the booth?
Okay, sure. Yeah. I thank you, Mr. Vice President, for allowing me to partake in this debate this afternoon. And I want to thank the Minister of Labour for bringing this piece of legislation here, the Foreign Labour Contracts and Repeal Bill 2021. Mr. Vice President, the Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and, residence within the borders of each state. And it also says that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. So therefore, if we are to look at this Declaration of Human Rights, this piece of legislation, this old legislation that we had there, certainly would have restricted the movements of our citizens to move outside of the country. And we got a good history from the Minister of Labour in terms of why it was necessary, the labour moving out, and also we heard the ill effects of some of our citizens who faced the burdens of disease, malaria, etc. in the Panama Canal, and probably other countries too. So this bill here, this repeal of this bill serves to really allow this movement. So we cannot really be expected in this day and age with the global movement that we would want to restrict any sort of our citizens from moving to be shackled by an old sort of colonial legislation, which probably at the time it would have served its purpose. So again, I thank the Minister for bringing this, and I want to say that, you know, the description of when we looked at the description given by the dismal working conditions, and some people, looked at that working conditions, the working conditions that existed, and the need to leave. You know, sometimes we have working conditions in Trinidad which might still, in certain aspects, in certain communities, that might still leave people wanting to leave. And I'm thinking that, you know, Section 3 showed the need to leave to go abroad, and the fact that people would have wanted to go abroad, there's still that need here. And there are still poor working conditions, Mr. Vice President, that I must just make mention of one quickly, that if I look at even the labor force, when I look at the CPEP workers, Mr. Vice President, they're doing an excellent job. But when I see they working in my community and they have no portable water in times of COVID or portable toilet in some sort of truck that they can carry, I look at them and say, hey, if I were in that position, I would want to go to a place offering better working conditions. So we have to look within our system how we could also improve our labor force, our workers, to give them that benefit of such a peace when they're working in terms of any sort of lack of hygiene or mention. So when I look also at the fact that in terms of the freedom of movement, we saw in the European Union that also came about, that the need for that freedom of movement, just as how we are now freeing up our citizens. The European Commission, when that came about, they actually said the persons within the European Union could have that freedom of movement. And again, our freeing ourselves of this bill also reminds me of the free movement of workers, which was a fundamental principle in the treaty enshrined in Article 45 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and it was developed by the European Union as a secondary legislation, and also by case law. So therefore, the need to look for a job in another country, the fact that you could work there without work permits, the fact that you could reside there for that purpose, stay there even after the employment has finished. And the Minister did mention the CARICOM workforce, that we have now that freedom of movement. This is something commendable that we can also look forward for this. But I also would be hoping, just as how the European nationals could now stay in the country of work, we may have to develop that within our CARICOM community also, that we could go and work in Barbados or other country and stay there. So we are now, in my opinion, having this repeal shows that we are looking at the global situations. We've seen what's happening in Europe. We see what happened in the international conventions. But I must make mention that, you know, we in Trinidad, we have looked at the labor force, and we do have business persons, other persons complaining they are struggling to get Trinidad workers in their labor force. And some of them are even hiring the migrant Venezuelan personnel. So this is a fact, be it the salaries are less, be it they get greater work ethic, whatever. So even if when we have this bill repealed and we have more freedom of movement, I'm just wondering, would we now be faced with a situation where our own persons here would be now having a poverty of people in the labor market? So we have to get better. We have to realize one of the fallout of this repeal would be a further migration of our workers, and as a result, greater level of despair among persons who want to hire local persons. The Venezuelan workers, sir, doing a good job, but the European Union, I must mention the fact that they also said that the workers must enjoy equal treatment with nationals in access to employment, working conditions, and all other social and tax advantages. And why I make mention of it, because Senator Wademark did mention that the protection of our workers outside is also important. So I had also brought up this similar situation when some members, I think it was 103 members, were actually trapped in Canada, in Ontario, during the COVID period when the work had stopped and those workers they couldn't return to Trinidad because of the lack of getting PCR testing and whatnot. So while Senator Mark made that concern, and it's a valid concern, we have people out there sometimes, I had made a suggestion that, and I'm making this suggestion now because it was raised, that our embassies could play a more important role. Any of our workers go out there, we can track them. We have the technology where we can track our workers. They can actually be in contact with the nearest embassy. And if there is any sort of failure or any sort of concerns, we have our people out there who will be able to look at the welfare of the workers. So this is not a problem that is unsurmountable. So there may be laws within the countries to protect workers, even foreign workers, but there may be also our own embassies out there will be able to play a greater role in protecting our workers. So this is something I'm thinking that we may have to get in our Minister of Foreign Affairs to get that on board. So anyone go in there. I had a patient, sir, who went Japan to work, and that patient actually...
Okay, so Senator, you've made that point, and I've allowed you to sort of give a solution to some of what has been raised. There's no need to go further.
Sure. So, thank you, sir. So what I also wanted to mention, Senator Wade Mark had mentioned that the fact that the University of the West Indies would have had persons on board who would also be wanting to go out of the West Indian environment. And I'm saying I have to make mention that we are doing an excellent job in terms of our education. We had, it was really the dream, I think, of our first Prime Minister to have an educated public. And I'm happy to say our UB graduates, we are among the top universities in the world. We are among the updated ranking is 2.5% in the universities. So what I'm saying is we also have to give knowledge to the fact that our university graduates may also want access to go outside, freedom of movement. We also have to bring into the fact that we have a lot of scholarship winners who are still working for jobs. We may now be able to say, well, we have this freedom of movement that we go on. So when I'm thinking that, okay, people want this freedom of movement, we think that it's a basic right, but we have to understand we are still under the fact that, the vaccine passports, the COVID vaccine passports are there, so it's not really a free movement that we may think. We still have to have that movement within other laws. So I also support this piece of legislation, not because it is just outdated and I'm seeing we are helping persons, but the fact is it could serve as a source where people can go abroad and earn foreign currency, because we have been seeing a lot of complaints of Forex, people not getting foreign currency. So again, this is an avenue where we can now get our labor force out there, be it in the Guyanese market, wherever, that we can have the idea that people could bring back that money, send that money to their relatives once they are working out of the foreign currency. So again, that's a great advantage. So I welcome this move. And like Senator Mark, I would have rather gotten some idea about the 119 persons who were consulted. It's easy, sir, to have a consultation and you say, well, we consulted with 119 persons. So in things like this, government should actually give us the dissenting voices. So we might have been able to judge better. Well, probably the unions disagreed with a certain factor about it. So I'm thinking in future, when we have pieces of legislation like this and government has consulted, to leave that out, give it to the public to be able to have a discernment. Is it something we are missing? Because we could be missing a valid concern as somebody could have brought up. I also want to make mention that the fact is, when we are looking at made mention that the labor force, I think Senator Lochmedial made mention about the endangered labor force scheme in here. Yes, our forefathers did migrate here. We came here for better promise. And again, I think because of that, we should be willing to support any piece of legislation who could give any Trinidadian the opportunity to go elsewhere, make themselves in a better condition, and to support their families and sometimes support their country. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, this repeal of the Act today is really a simple exercise, and I'm surprised that it was complicated so much. There seems to be a misinterpretation of what we are doing here today. The Act generally restricts movement from people leaving the Twin Island state of Trinidad and Tobago. And I hear talk about replacing it. So do we replace an archaic law with a draconian law? Are we going to do, what do we really want to do? But Mr. Vice President, let me just put on the record a couple of things that came out. There was a lot of good talk, but not relevant talk. I would like to put on record that yes, FITAM and JTAM and NATOC was in fact in relation to Senator Wade Mark's query whether the unions were involved. Yes, they were involved, and yes, they agreed to repeal the Act. I hear the concern of the opposition and the senators about what do we replace this with. And I just want to say that there are a number of legislative items that would be coming in short order with regards to the Recruitment of Workers Act, the Trafficking in Persons Act, the Workers and Employment Standard Act, and the Workmen Compensation Act. These acts, in and of themselves, really reach into many of the areas that persons wanted to bring up in regard to what's happening in the world today, where how do we, in fact, deal with issues coming out of the international labor organizations, the different treaties, and so on. And all of that, Mr. Vice President, will be done in due course. But today, what we are tasked with is repealing a piece of archaic legislation that limits the outward movement of people from Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore, the other issues that have been highlighted are not necessarily relevant at this time. So, Mr. Vice President, I don't think I have a lot to answer based on relevance, except to give some comfort that we are looking at legislation that will cover all those areas. And with that, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond. And Mr. Vice President, I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is, Senator Lyda, are you done? Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act, Chapter 8811, be now read a second time. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Minister of Labour.
Mr. Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 66-1, I beg to move that the Foreign Labour Contracts Repeal Bill 2021 be committed to the Committee of the Whole, Senate, forthwith, and to be considered clause by clause.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the Foreign Labour Contracts Repeal Bill 2021 be committed to a Committee of the Whole, Senate, forthwith, to be considered clause by clause. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Senate shall now go into Committee of the Whole to consider the bill clause by clause. Honorable Senators, this particular piece of legislation has 2 clauses to it, and as far as I'm aware, no amendments have been circulated prior. We shall now go through bill clause by clause.
Clause 1.
The question is that clause 1 stand part of the bill. Honorable Senators, the question is that clause 1 now stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Clause 1 now stands part of the bill.
Clause 2.
The question is that clause 2 stand part of the bill. Honorable Senators, the question is that clause 2 now stand part of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Clause 2 now stands part of the bill. Honorable Senators, the question is that the bill be now reported to the Senate. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The bill will now be reported to the Senate. Minister of Labour.
Yes, Mr. Vice President, I wish to report that the Foreign Labour Contracts Repeal Bill 2021 was considered in the Committee of the Whole and approved without amendments. I now beg to move that the Senate agree with the committee report SO 69-1.
Honorable Senators, the question is that this Senate agree with the committee's report on the Foreign Labour Contracts Repeal Bill 2021. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Minister of Labour.
President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act, Chapter 8811, be now read a third time and passed.
Honorable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act, Chapter 8811, be now read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Repeal the Foreign Labour Contracts Act, Chapter 8111.
Honorable Senators, at this juncture, I think it's a good time to take a small break, so this Senate will now stand suspended for 10 minutes.